Okay, good morning, seventh graders. This will be the last lecture for the chapter 14 before our tests, so pay close attention. When last we talked about the war, there was the Battle of Fredericksburg. General Burnside, the Union commander, very foolishly decided to attack Confederate army on a hill behind a stone wall, and it was a slaughter. He was eventually a couple months later removed from command of the Army of the Potomac, and it was given to a man named General Hooker. Well, General Hooker, in the spring of 1863, decided he had a gigantic army. It was more than twice the size of Robert E. Lee's. I mean, it was big, and so he decided to split his army in half. One of the halves would threaten Fredericksburg, and the other would go around behind the Confederate army on the west of Fredericksburg. And so Robert E. Lee would be caught between two armies, two pieces of an army. Each piece was as big as Robert E. Lee's entire army. Well, as it turned out, and to make a long story short, because this is not a military history, Robert E. Lee did something amazing. He took his army, he split it, which was half the size of Hooker's, he split it into three pieces, and he swung part of his army around Hooker's and attacked. And this forced Hooker to retreat part of his army. And then Robert E. Lee continued to attack both parts of Hooker's army and drove them back. And in the end, it was the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it was the greatest victory for Robert E. Lee. Unfortunately for the Confederates, during that battle, when Stonewall Jackson during the nighttime went to reconnoiter or scout the Union positions, when he and his men came riding back toward the Confederate lines, it was pitch black at night, and the Confederate sentries, the guards, thought that he was a Union cavalry officer, so they opened fire. He was critically wounded by his own men, and a few days later he died of pneumonia. He had his arm amputated, and he lost his left arm, and then a few days later he died of pneumonia. And Robert E. Lee never recovered from that. The Confederacy never did. Jackson was arguably their best general, certainly as good as Lee. And Robert E. Lee said, General Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm. And so when Jackson died, the Confederates never were the same again. Well, at this point in time, Robert E. Lee decided to attack the North again, invade the North one more time. So he marched up through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, and the Union Army very slowly followed him. Now, the Union Army had a new commander by the name of George Meade, and when Robert E. Lee found out that the Union Army was closer than he thought, he called for all of his pieces of his army to come together at a convenient spot, and it turned out that the town of Gettysburg had all the roads led into Gettysburg. So Robert E. Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, headed south, actually, ironically, south into Gettysburg, while the Union Army moved north into Gettysburg. So the Battle of Gettysburg started with the South and the North and the North and the South. It was just really weird. Well, the armies ran into each other by accident on July 1st, 1863. The first day was a Confederate victory. They drove the Union forces back to a long line of hills, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and later the Little and Big Round Tops, they were called. And they were shaped like a fish hook, okay, with the barb, the curved barb to the north, and then the shaft going straight down to the south. Well, the Confederates never were able to capture the high ground on that first day. So the second day they attacked on both flanks, both sides of the Union Army, and they very nearly broke through, but not quite. And they were forced back. So on the third day, Robert E. Lee ordered a general attack on the center of the Union line. And the problem was the Confederates had to cross a mile of open grassy field against a low ridge. Now, it wasn't a real high ridge, but it was a low ridge. But the Union was dug in there. And it's known as Pickett's Charge, named after the general whose division took part in the attack. Over 15,000 Confederates attacked. And it was the high point of the Confederate army. They briefly, a few hundred of them briefly punched a hole in the Union line, but they were driven back out. And in the end, they lost 7,000 of the 15,000 men who made the attack. I think 7,000. They lost about half of their men. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Lasted 3 days, 51,000 casualties. It was the largest battle, bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. 160,000 men fought in the battle. And the South never recovered from the battle. They never recovered because they lost 28,000 men, and the Union lost 23,000 men at Gettysburg. Well, in November, Abraham Lincoln went to Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery down there, the National Cemetery, and he gave the famous Gettysburg Address. And that's in your book. Part of your worksheet is to read that and answer some questions. Probably the greatest speech ever given in American history. Meanwhile, out west, General Grant was trying to figure out how to capture Vicksburg. And the problem was, if you came in from the north of Vicksburg, your supply lines were really long, and the Confederate cavalry could cut them. If you came down the Mississippi to the north and then came in along the Mississippi River there, Vicksburg was on a bluff, and so you couldn't and there was a swamp kind of in front of it to the northwest, and so you couldn't get in that way. So, and you couldn't get past Vicksburg because there were cannons all along the bluff to shoot down in the Mississippi River. So Grant experimented and did a lot of different things. Finally, what happened was he marched his army on the Louisiana side of the river, the west side of the river, all the way down past Vicksburg. And then the Union Navy made a dash for it with ironclads and steamboats past the guns of Vicksburg. Although they lost some ships and a lot were damaged. Enough ships made it past that they could ferry Grant's army across the river to the Mississippi side. And so from there, Grant marched east, captured Jackson, Mississippi, the capital city, the capital town of Mississippi, and then headed west, surrounded Vicksburg on 3 sides. So the Confederates found themselves besieged with the Mississippi River behind them and Grant's whole army in front of them. For a couple of months, the siege took place. The people of Vicksburg started to starve. They ate horses and mules and rats, even cats and dogs and rats. And in the end, July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. So July 1st through 3rd was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was a disaster for the Confederates. And then July 4th, the following day, Vicksburg surrendered. So it was a double disaster from which the Confederates could never recover. After that, the main thing for the Union to do was they finished capturing the Mississippi River, so it cut the Confederacy into 2 pieces. The Union now controlled the Mississippi. They had blockaded most of the Confederate coast, so the Anaconda Plan was actually working pretty well. Meanwhile, the Union Army had attempted to move down toward Chattanooga with mixed success. In September 1863, the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War took place in Georgia at a place called Chickamauga. It actually was a Confederate victory. Over 34,000 people were killed or wounded in that battle. It was very bloody. And the Union retreated back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were surrounded by the Confederates who tried to besiege the city. Well, in November, Grant and Sherman went down into Chattanooga. They were able to get through with their army into Chattanooga. And they threw the Confederates out. They basically broke the siege. And so in the spring of 1864, the road was open from Chattanooga down to Atlanta, Georgia. So in the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln made Ulysses Grant the overall commander of all Union forces. So he decided, instead of sitting in an office in Washington, he would go with General Meade with the Army of the Potomac against Robert E. Lee up in Virginia. And Grant gave Sherman command of the army down in Chattanooga. So both of those armies began their final campaigns. Grant, well, let me just tell you about Sherman. Sherman marched from Chattanooga down to Atlanta. His army, again, was about twice the size of Joe Johnston, who was the Confederate commander. And it was a lot of maneuvering, outflanking, the Confederates. And to make a long story short, in September, he captured Atlanta. In November, he decided he was going to march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean and destroy everything in his path. And it was known as the March to the Sea. So he disappeared for a while. Him and his entire army, they cut their connections with the North and just lived off the land. 60-mile wide swath of destruction cut all the way across Georgia. Sherman said he's going to make Georgia howl, and he did. And by Christmas, he was in Savannah. And again, to make a long story short, he moved up through South Carolina, captured Columbia, and then eventually the Confederate Army in North Carolina surrendered to him in April of 1865 up in Raleigh, North Carolina. So that's Sherman's campaign. Grant moved down through Virginia, and his goal was to capture Richmond, but his other goal was to just continue to fight Lee, because he knew for every Union soldier that was killed, a Confederate soldier could be killed too, and the Union could replace their losses, but the Confederates could not. So Grant's goal was to just fight Lee the whole time. So the bloodiest campaign of the entire Civil War was in May and June of 1864. The Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, they were slaughters. The Battle of Spotsylvania was so incredibly fierce that a 22-inch in diameter oak tree, oak is a very hard wood, oak tree was cut down during the battle only by bullets, okay? They had chewed through a 22-inch oak tree. That's how ferocious. In the end, Grant swung around Richmond, came up the south side of Richmond, a place called Petersburg, and Robert E. Lee stopped him at Petersburg, but they had to dig trenches. So they dug trenches at Petersburg, and Grant just laid down to a siege of Petersburg, which ultimately led to the long-term destruction of the Confederate Army. So that was 1864. There was also a presidential election, and your book really doesn't talk about it, but it was pretty important. All this was taking place in an election year, 1864, and Lincoln was sure he was going to lose the election. He was up against General McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate. Well, McClellan had said he was going to offer peace terms to the Confederacy. So in essence, the North would lose the war and the Confederates would be free if McClellan, they'd have their own country if McClellan was elected president. Well, fortunately for him, Sherman's Atlanta campaign won the election. Once he defeated the Confederates and took Atlanta, and once Grant pinned Lee down at Petersburg, people realized that the North had fought too long and hard to give up. And so Lincoln was reelected in 1864. 1865, it's really kind of short and sweet. The Confederate Army just began to desert. They were out of food and out of supplies. Their morale was low. And in early April of 1865, Grant's army attacked at Petersburg, broke through, captured Richmond, forced the Confederate government to flee. Robert E. Lee, with his army, headed west, trying to get to a place called Danville so that they could go down south to North Carolina and join up with another Confederate army, small Confederate army down there. But he was surrounded by Union troops at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. And on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. And that, for all intent and purposes, ended the war. There were other armies that surrendered all the way through the month of May. But that, ladies and gentlemen, was the Civil War. The North won the Civil War. The South was devastated. Fortunately, the North was the industrial part of America, and they suffered no damage at all. In fact, they grew. African American troops were finally allowed into the Union Army about halfway through the war, but they were in segregated units, fought by themselves. Fortunately, African Americans were allowed to be in the United States Navy with white sailors right from the beginning of the war. I'll let you read about the contributions of women and so forth, because these lectures have to be about 15 minutes, otherwise they're too long for YouTube for me to upload. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the chapter 14. Please look at your study guide. The test will be probably next Tuesday. Okay, I want to do it next Tuesday. So you guys have a good one and hang in there. Bye.